Hello and good afternoon. My name is Will Hubbard, and I'm a professor here at the University of Baltimore School of Law, and I'm also the director of our Center for the Law of Intellectual Property and Technology. I'm pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar, which looks at the growing threat of ransomware attacks on our nation's businesses, utilities, municipalities, and even universities. Just last week, Howard University had to cancel classes after a ransomware attack on its IT network. We're going to cover some interesting topics in this afternoon's discussion. What can and should organizations do to prevent ransomware attacks or to minimize the damage from such attacks? What is the role of cybersecurity lawyers and other specialists in helping clients to prevent these kinds of attacks? And over the next hour, our three panelists, all cybersecurity experts with direct experience in this area, will share their thoughts on these questions and more. I'd like to begin by introducing our three panelists. First, Jerry Bodman is an adjunct professor at UB Law, where he teaches cybersecurity law, cyberspace law, and information privacy. He spent over 22 years in the US Navy and in the intelligence community, where among other things, he managed computer network operations. Mr. Bodman is also an alumnus of UB Law, and he earned an LLM in national security from Georgetown. Our second panelist is also a UB Law alum, David Katz, who is a partner with the Atlanta-based law firm of Adams and Reese. Mr. Katz leads its privacy, cybersecurity, and data management team. He advises clients in multiple sectors on how to protect their data assets, assess and manage risk, and mitigate damage should there be a cybersecurity threat. Mr. Katz has counseled numerous clients through data breaches and writes often on cybersecurity issues. Our final panelist is Todd Carter, who is the Chief Information Officer and Chief Digital Officer for the City of Baltimore. He started in these roles in May 2019, which happened to be on the same day as the Robin Hood ransomware attack on the city. In his new role, he managed that breach and oversaw the complete rebuilding of the city government's IT infrastructure and security. Before joining the City of Baltimore, Mr. Carter enjoyed a long career with the utility company Exelon and its subsidiaries, Baltimore Gas and Electric and Constellation, most recently as Vice President of IT Portfolio Management and Enterprise Architecture at Exelon. Before we get started, I'd also like to briefly address the ground rules of our discussion. We're going to be using a conversational format prompted by questions from me and from you in the audience. We'll be taking questions as we go, rather than waiting until the end of the program. And I encourage you to use the chat feature to pose your questions. Chris Stutz, our Director of Communications, will be helping me to keep the queue. We may not get to all of your questions, but we will hopefully get to many of them. I also want to note at the outset that some of our panelists may not be able to answer some of your questions regarding ongoing investigations into ransomware attacks. Lastly, to give us some structure, we plan to divide our conversation roughly into thirds, with the first third addressing the technical and factual foundations of ransomware, the middle third addressing some general considerations for preventing and resolving attacks, and the final third focusing on some more specific legal dimensions to ransomware. So with that, let's get started. And I'd like to begin just with the general question of what exactly is ransomware and how does this technology work?
Well, I'll start there. So you can think of ransomware as an app. So something that gets delivered via some other mechanism. So oftentimes it'll spread via a malicious payload, anything traditional access vectors, malware, phishing, social engineering, water hole attacks, supply chain, vulnerability exposure. So like the SMB vulnerability, MS-1710 was an example of one that's been used. Anything that allows you to get an initial access vector Passwords is another one that people oftentimes just buy access. These people will go to access vendors and just buy access to certain networks, and then they just drop their payload. So anything that gets you initial access, they jump into the network, they spread, doing some sort of reconnaissance, collecting information about the target, trying to understand where the vulnerable bits are, and then they deploy the payload, which encrypts the data, and the rest is pretty well known. But I think that one of the most important things, I guess, is just that there isn't like one way in and one way out. There's it's whatever is the most common, easy to use access vector is what they're going to use.
I think I'll just add to what Jerry had mentioned, in that there's a focus on business systems for ransomware, but there's also a lot of activity in operational systems, and the firmware that's associated with those control devices for your water systems, your plant systems, and it affects you in different ways. And you get attacked by different means. It's through sometimes supply chain having malicious code in their component parts, which are then sold throughout a particular industry, which are put in various manufacturing plant computers or plant computer systems. And so that's another way that ransomware can kind of attack you and cause damage to your business.
And just to make sure that I understand, when you say that it attacks operational systems and firmware, do you mean that hardware may be incapable of running following a ransomware attack? So actual hardware infrastructure machines and things like that?
Absolutely. If you have a particular control device that opens and closes a valve, and you can inject software firmware that disrupts that opening and closing of a particular valve, you can do a lot of damage to a control system.
William, one thing I just want to add to that is, you just heard kind of Jerry and Todd kind of walk through the technical components of an attack. But I think one thing to mention for the folks that may not be so technical is that at the outset of an attack, one of the most important things that you have in terms of the investigation are, in some cases, and more often most cases, outside experts coming in to examine what occurred in the IT environment. And from the lawyer's perspective, it's a very delicate time introducing a new team to the existing technical team, because just as you heard sort of these descriptions, it requires both sides at the outset to have a degree of trust in order to carry out this investigation. Sometimes that can be tricky.
I would say very tricky, David, because one thing that as that new team comes in, the team that's experienced the ransomware is in the state of confusion in terms of just what happened here. And you bring in the specialist, whether it's the forensic analysis, the counsel to guide and direct you. And it's a very trying time for teams that are initially on the ground, adjusting to the new structure, new way of thinking about how to attack a ransomware, or how to attack back at the ransomware, remediate it, and move forward. So totally agree.
And in this issue of trust and ransomware spreading, how much can this spread? It can spread within someone's network. Can it spread to the networks of business partners and private contractors working with government? And how much can it spread?
Absolutely. So I think that depends on the method that's used. So if it's a wormable exploit, you can certainly, the WannaCry bit was wormable. You can jump from network to network. Typically, a lot of these are very, very strict in the sense that there might be a link. And so if you got the email and you clicked on the link, you might have got the payload download. And so in that case, these folks have gotten into spamming. So they'll exploit your computer, download your contacts, and then spam others. So that's a method to try to spread. And so they can certainly spread from your network to all of your contacts networks. So it really depends on the method, but it absolutely, is pretty dangerous and pretty quick to spread.
One of the things that we had to deal with in Baltimore was some of our partners, our business partners, who we do B2B business with. We needed to give them assurance that we could not impact their systems. And we had to partner with the state of Maryland, our CISO, and others, just to tell them that, for instance, we have no trust between our network and your network. And therefore, the ransomware and how it spread, that will not occur through the means from Baltimore City. And we had to do that with a number of trading partners, because the moment it's known that you have been attacked by ransomware, just about everyone's going to shut down their links with you to ensure that you don't pose a threat to them.
The other part of an attack is really, that first phase is the containment piece, and you may not have visibility into how the attack is actually ongoing when you first become aware of it. And part of that is, deploying sensors throughout the environment to determine where are the attackers and what are they doing in real time. So, being able to give assurances about, or being able to know exactly what's happening sometimes can get very foggy at the beginning as you're trying to tamp down on what's going on.
So all of this sounds, a little terrifying. You don't know how big the problem is. You don't know where it came from. You don't know how much it is spread. So how bad is the problem? Is it headlines that are attention grabbing, or is this a growing pandemic that we really need to worry about?
Well, I think so what's interesting is if you look at the most recent reporting on this, so the ransomware task force reporting and the Sophos reporting, it looks like some of the numbers are coming down for 2021 compared to 2018, 2019, 2020. 2020, it seemed like an all-time high. Some of the numbers have come down for 2021. And I don't know if that's because people are responding to it, people are starting to take it seriously. But the numbers are definitely coming down. But then again, it's not letting off. You're just getting like a slight reprieve in terms of technique. And I think some of it is the government started to respond, and we've had some weird, funky occurrences. Like there was some data center in some country that caught fire in the middle of the night and shut down one of the ransomware vendors. And you've had other vendors who have just given up and said, they're going to stop their operations, and many people think they've just rebranded and come out with a different technique. So maybe it's just a slowdown because there's a lot of attention. Not too sure yet, but it's certainly not going away. And with all of all the different vulnerability access points that exist, and the fact that there's a lot of money to be made, it's not going away anytime soon.
Just to build on that, I mean, one thing I think that everyone's become accustomed to in the last year and a half is just uncertainty. And these events create tremendous uncertainty. But the reality is there's enough information in the market and enough resources available that you can begin to plan and kind of war game these scenarios and develop some strategies so that, the first time you're dealing with this is not after all your systems are locked up. And I really think that has to be the approach going forward. And it can really save you if you've done the least amount of kind of preparation for something like this.
I'll add a different take to the question. Insurance carriers, the insurance for ransomware is going up sky high. We're finding that there are minimum stakes that you have to be able to pass just to get insurance. You have to have multi-factor authentication. You need to have a tabletop incident response drill. And so the insurance industry is changing around this whole thing of ransomware, because there have been a number of just businesses, institutions that have been attacked, and insurance companies have been hit really, really hard as well. So I can see it from the insurance side of the business, as we've approached, given all the changes that we've made, that's still a challenge for us.
So I'm going to ask one of the questions from the audience that one of my former students, Raymond Brown, has asked, and he asks, if I mean, as I understand it, this concept of vector is akin to the way that we see diseases transmitted in the non-virtual world. And if this is the means by which ransomware is delivered, what should we be seeing as the next vector without giving any bad actors suggestions here this afternoon? What should we be thinking to worry about that is not yet been a vector for transmission?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that that they need a new vector. I think if you look at what they're using now, they use common access tools like threat emulation software like Cobalt Strike. They use Mimikatz. They use existing Trojans like Emotet and TrickBot. They're using tried and true, essentially espionage techniques, phishing, social engineering, spamming, water hole attacks, supply chain, and all of that works. And then there's a never-ending supply of unpatched vulnerabilities, right? Every patch Tuesday or whatever comes out, Microsoft comes out with a new list of things that you have to patch. And there's some window in between the time that people get patched and that there's this public knowledge. And these exploit folks are going out and taking this code and engineering new payloads and then turning around and operationalizing them. So I don't know that you need a new vector because there are so many that work.
The other thing that I saw this year was the double ransomware attack, where they've encrypted the machine, but they've provided a message that says, if you don't make the payment, we're going to release the data that we've accessed and acquired. So you have to make the choice of paying and then worrying about, will they release what data they do have. So that's it's not necessarily a new vector, but it's an innovation in terms of how the attack's carried out. People are seeing.
And I don't know that I quite I understand the question, and certainly the answers that Jerry and David provided make sense. When I think about the distinction between a nation state looking to attack you versus organized criminals versus the Joe Blow that's in his basement, and I think the level of sophistication between each of those different tiers of attackers maybe it's over time. The tools that a nation state may use may begin to filter down to some of those lower level criminals. If that's the case, you could potentially see ransomware at a much lower level, much more individual level than what you see today. But I think it's just more speculation to the question at this point.
So along those lines, though, you mentioned nation states as some of the aggressors with ransomware, and is one of the ways of starting to wrap your hands around the scope of the problem is to get a sense of who are the actors who might want to target my institution. I'd like to think that that there's not a nation state that is interested in targeting the University of Baltimore. And so that then affects the extent to which we need to worry about ransomware. So in general terms, who are these actors and what do they want? And give us some idea of the complexity in there, the different types of actors with different goals.
I think as far as, the two big groups are criminals and nation states, right? So criminals are obviously in this to make money, and that's probably 99% of the ransomware out there. And one of the things that you're seeing, though, the NotPetya attack was, largely believed to be associated with the GRU, which is the Russian military intelligence, and that was a cover for an attack on Ukraine. So they used it as plausible cover. Oh, it's just malware, it's just ransomware. Instead, it targeted the Ukraine, it targeted their operations, and it shut things down, right? Same with Treasury has come out and made public statements about FSB having connections to ransomware actors. So, and there are some ransomware that will try to vet the different victims before they just distribute the payload. And many of them say, no, not in Russia. So it can be in the US, it can be in Canada, it can be in India, it can be all these other ones, but not Russia, right? So clearly there is some focus and some energy from Russian state actors there. And there's also been some public reporting with respect to North Korea using ransomware as a way of making money to evade sanctions. But for the most part, this is just everyday Joe Blow criminal. And you don't have to be working with nation state actors to get access to these exploits, because there's an economy that's grown out, right? So you have people whose sole job it is to get access, steal passwords, and then they sell them to someone else. And it's their job then to run the malware, and then they sell that access to someone else, and then they work the payment. And so it's like an industry now, right? And so, and there's so many people out there that are still vulnerable or aren't ready or aren't prepared that, there's a lot of meat on the bone. So it's going to be a while.
That was well said. I agree with everything Jerry said. I think he nailed it.
Now, okay, let's we're 20 minutes in, so let's shift gears to kind of our middle portion, talking about what companies, institutions, and governments can do to address ransomware. And Mr. Carter, you mentioned tabletop strategy and two-factor authentication. Are these things going to help?
I think they will help in some cases, but I think it's a broader set of variables than just those items. You have to keep up to date on your patching. That's a must. You have to have some sort of program that you're giving your users a sense of, you're training them in terms of their awareness to the different ways that they can be attacked and the different ways that they can be exploited, what to do and what not to do. And then you also just have to have discipline within your organization to execute on that training and to execute on the patching. And then it also boils down to the types of tools that you use for the various components of your security posture. Some are weaker than others. Some have exploits, and so I think that's just one piece of it. It's a broader set from an organizational perspective, and I can tell you from just being on the wrong side of a ransomware attack, it definitely brings the awareness up within an organization, and keeping that momentum, taking advantage of that to stress the training and awareness, and all the investment that's needed is those things come into play as well.
I think if you're somebody with any level of responsibility in the organization for this area, you have to be willing to go in to the senior management team at the highest level of the organization, perhaps the board, and say, what is our data worth in the market if we had no access to it? If our reputation was going to be imperiled, what's the number that we'd be willing to spend? And then work back from there to say, how comfortable do we feel with our security controls? Have we done a risk assessment to show how vulnerable we are? And are we willing to correct it? If we have gaps, if we have talent gaps, should we take that dollar figure, and even if we split it in half, be willing to spend it if we haven't previously? I think those are real important conversations to have long before you're in the position of being, having a gun, a proverbial gun to the head.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add another bit. I think there's a lot you can do, and sometimes I think it probably feels overwhelming. So, and I hate to say this cliche, but the attackers essentially don't need to do much, right? So if you get one person who clicks on the link, somebody comes in, right? If you get one person who clicked on an email attachment that they didn't need to, or that picked up a USB drive in the parking lot and brought it in and connected it to the computer. And those are all things that can be done to protect your network. You can protect against those things with training, but then there are other things like, keeping all your software up to date and doing scans for vulnerabilities based on things in the supply chain, and using antivirus and the monitoring your network, right? Those are all things that you can do on the IT side that don't involve anyone other than the IT staff. So you've just got these layers that you have to do, and unfortunately you have to do them all in order to give yourself the best possible chance to win. And then at the end of the day, you might still get hit. So the question is, how resilient can you be? Have you done the tabletop exercise? Have you planned for, have you checked your insurance policy to make sure that you're actually going to get covered? And do you have any triggers or any thresholds where they say, oh, you have to talk to this, you have to talk to us first, and then you can go to a forensic company, or then you can do that. Like, you have to know the flow so that when something starts, you're pre-positioned to just run the course rather than learning as it happens. So I think for me, those are the biggest things you can do. Yeah, there's some training, there's some employment stuff. Yeah, there's a bunch of IT stuff, but it's also getting your company ready. And this is where I think lawyers, and I teach a cybersecurity law class, and the whole reason that I created this class was because I felt like there was a gap in the legal community in terms of lawyers who could speak to the technical folks, understand them, and do issue spotting and help them get to the right space. And so we've been pushing this agenda to try to get these folks, these students trained in the cybersecurity field. And I think it's exciting, and but there's a lot that can be done, and lawyers can play a huge part.
So you mentioned antivirus, and as a kind of to many people, that sounds like it should be a fix to this problem. And I see you shaking your head. And can you explain why that is?
Sure, it's not a fix. So what it is it's at a minimum, it's kind of like, so, all of these folks, these ransomware actors, they test their payloads, right, against VirusTotal or you name it, right? And so they know ahead of time if their payload is going to work on any one of those antiviruses. And then if it gets hit, they'll just make a tweak, right? And then they'll send it out, and maybe they get 80% impact, maybe they get 50% impact. They don't need a lot of impact in order to put potential victims in the queue. That's all they're trying to do, right? They're trying to get past that first stage, get a bunch of victims in the queue, and then figure out what the next angle is. And they're just running a pipeline, right? So they're getting a bunch of people ready, they exploit them, they do recon, they pull the data back, and they put them in the part of the queue where somebody does the customer service and negotiates. And then there's a whole bunch of other people that are just finding, the very next day, finding the new list of folks who you can exploit and put in the queue. And so antivirus doesn't help but it's necessary, and you need it because it might stop. You might be in that 20% where they were lazy and said, well, okay, fine, I won't get all the Malwarebytes users, but I'll get everybody else. And then if you're using Malwarebytes, boom, you've dodged a bullet. So I think you take all the chances you can get, and you do everything you can to avoid it. And AV is pretty cheap, so it's darn near negligent not to have it.
Yeah, I totally agree. When I think back to Jerry also mentioned just the different layers that you need to have at the network, Active Directory, and so on. The virus protection can help, but if someone gets an admin password and starts to move around, no amount of antivirus can help you at that point in time. I've talked to people that have or going through ransomware attacks, just as we reached out to people when we were going through it. And as you hear them talk about those different layers of protection and what either you do or you do not have in place. And I think the investment required to keep those layers up to date, whether it's at the network layer, the operating system layer, patching, et cetera. I think those are the things that help you to be more vulnerable than less vulnerable, and thus get attacked above and beyond just virus protection.
Well, one thing that I see quite a bit is that, you know, IT operations is not necessarily IT security. And those are two very different organizations and operations with end goals. And there's still very much today, still a lack of expertise in an IT operations shop around security. And so that's, I think, a contributing factor to why, you know, these vulnerabilities continue to exist and why you see so many attacks.
We're talking about some of the targets of ransomware. Many of the entities we're talking about were really large organizations, and they, you know, produced these headlines that were really, you know, grabbed your eyes. But talking about the remedial and preventative measures, they start to sound complicated and expensive. And how much is ransomware a problem for medium and small companies, or, God forbid, individuals like law professors?
I think it's a big company problem. They certainly will go after, we've seen them go after schools, elementary schools, right? So they'll go after anybody they think has money. If you're an education system, if you're a government, if you're a business, you know, a meat packing business, or if you're in critical infrastructure like Colonial Pipeline, if you're in a healthcare community, they go after any of these groups because they recognize that they are important and that people care about their operational status and their data loss. And so they go after the people that have vulnerabilities and that can pay. And oftentimes, even if they don't get the big sums of money, they're getting 170,000 or something from an elementary school, they'll take it and they'll walk away because it's $170,000. And could they have gotten 70 million from somebody else? Sure. But guess what? You know, you got to pay the bills. So every little bit counts. And sometimes you give a discount to somebody in order to get some revenue. So there's just old-fashioned business methodology here as well, right?
And from my experiences, the smaller businesses mid-sized businesses that I've come in contact with who were quote unquote dealing with ransomware, they were, I would say it's the early stages, or ransomware that hasn't spread. It was really contained. It was almost as if the criminals just didn't have the time or the want to go on the extra effort, or take the extra effort to exploit that particular client. So I just haven't had a lot of experience with mid-sized organizations at ransomware. But the few I did, it was very limited in the scope of what happened.
In terms of other responses to ransomware, what kind of remedial measures can you take? Can you decrypt? Can you restore from backups? And if so, what are some of the considerations in thinking about those options?
So I think one of the key things for us as we went through ransomware was, did we have backups that were not impacted by the ransomware? And I forgot who said it earlier. Maybe it was David, but when you first get hit, you have to assess just like what the heck is going on. Where has this ransomware spread, and what has been specifically encrypted, and what kind of ransomware is it? And at that point in time, you can begin to build your strategy to move forward. And a big piece of that strategy is, can you recover? Well, certainly how deeply were you affected by the ransomware, but also do you have viable backups that you can recover from? And in a lot of cases, most ransomware criminals, they are trying to get to those backups so they can make sure that they don't give you an option out of paying them the ransom. So I think one definite component in terms of preventable measures is to make sure you have really good backups that are protected in a manner that offsite protected in a manner that the ransomware criminals can't get to them.
I would add, so I think offsite is 100% right, and offline generally. I think you don't want to have like essentially auto backups, right? You don't want to have everything automatically backing up every night, because then they land, they deploy, maybe they put a timer on it, and then it ends up in your backup. And then if you try to restore from backup, then it's already there, right? So like you need to have some way of recognizing, where there's a clean copy and like storing it periodically, maybe storing them in different places and different copies or something, right? But yeah, I mean, that's, to be resilient, you have to know where your data is and how clean it is.
I'd say too, I mean, this is another good example of, you should go ahead and spend the money to pay the white hat hackers, the good guys, to come in and tell you where you're vulnerable. And without being pejorative, I mean, there's not much difference between the black hat hackers and the white hat hackers. It's the same community, just good guys and bad guys. So the guys that are doing this for a living, they can come in and tell you, very quickly how you can get owned and how many different ways you can get owned. And then you'll have some visibility into how to correct it. But without that, you're guessing. I mean, you just can't see the blind spots all the time. So it's incredibly powerful, and I think money well spent if there's budget for it.
A couple questions from the Q&A chat. What do you think is a good time frame for backups?
So I think it's a combination of I mean, there are many different backup schemes, whether you do a daily or a full weekly or incremental. So there are many different backup schemes, but I think relative to ransomware, you definitely want to have them offsite, and you want to have some randomness into it. And as Jerry mentioned, offline. And I think, operationally, you look at backups from the standpoint of, how do I maintain business for normal business reasons in case you lose file, you lose data. You don't do it specifically for the ransomware. And so to that end, whether you do daily backups, then a full, and then weekly backups, then a full monthly backup, quarterly backups, then many different schemes of doing that. I think each business will have some operational characteristics that'll determine what that schedule is. My sense, though, is that the ability to have them offsite and particularly offline relative to ransomware is a proper scheme to have.
Are insurance companies requiring backups in their policies?
We are just going through ours. The short answer is yes. The long answer is their expectations relative to the backups being encrypted, the types of tools that you have that quote unquote can guard your backup from malicious intent, and whether or not it's offline or online.
The carriers are doing. Sorry, Todd, were you done?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, the carriers are, as someone mentioned, I think Todd, they're spending much more time in the underwriting process, determining whether they're going to provide coverage and what the premium will be, in the form of questionnaires that require you to provide information about the control frameworks that you employ and information about your backups. And it's really important that those policies are reviewed on a yearly basis because of how quickly things are changing. We had one client that had $2 million worth of coverage, but the cyber extortion coverage was sublimited to $25,000. So with a ransomware amount demand well above 25,000, that policy was really at this point kind of outdated, and they didn't really have the coverage where they needed it. So it's a constant review. The other final point on that is, if you're an executive and you don't really understand how these attacks work, the best place to go is the coverage that you have, because it lays out specifically all of the things that will be available to you in the face of an attack. And that's a good way to educate people and management about, hey, this is what we're facing and this is what we have coverage for. And that can take the shock out of it when it finally happens a little bit.
So, one of the things that we talk about in our cybersecurity class is insurance and kind of what you need to know. And we use I won't give you the name of the company, but we use an application, and I have them look at the application and try to figure out like how would you respond to this. And so I pulled that application up just to double check, and they do have, as one of the check boxes when they as part of your application, do you encrypt sensitive data? Do you have critical software patching? Do you have critical data backup and recovery procedures? Do you have a formal incident response plan? So these are things that they ask you as part of your application. And then if they go, if you turn around and fudged it, or the person that filled it out didn't know the answers and said, oh yeah, of course we do, right? Then you're exposed to that, they could potentially, deny your claim after the fact if like they find out that you didn't actually have these things. But you said that you did in the application, right? So they're absolutely looking for that risk exposure in the application stage. And so, there's a fairly high level for these companies to get this insurance. And I think, Todd, you alluded to that earlier about some of the things that you've seen, right?
Yeah, we are literally going through that process now. And I go through line by line our application with our chief security officer. And then we meet with our chief risk officer to go through that as well, just to make sure that everything on the application is pristine. And then typically we have to give presentations to various, brokers and and Q&A, et cetera. So it's a very extensive process that you go through, that you can go through.
This is a nice kind of transition into our last third for our conversation here tonight, and to talk more specifically about the role of lawyers. And already we're talking about some important legal work in negotiating and understanding the insurance policies that can apply. What are some of the other legal dimensions that must be considered in the face of ransomware?
I'll start. I think that at the onset of a ransomware attack, having access to trained cybersecurity lawyers to help manage communication, to help document the extent of the attack for insurance purposes, to help communicate broadly across multiple stakeholders, and to help you with any legal or other types of filings that you may do. I think that role is indispensable, especially I'm certainly for larger scale ransomware. Those are we relied on a number of lawyers. Our incident commander was a cybersecurity lawyer, and just having that perspective with, just going through the detection, remediation, recovery type phases of a ransomware, that was extreme help for us. I'm sure two lawyers on here, you guys have opinions, but I figure I start first with that, and I say that without hesitation.
One of the challenges that I see in our cases is that by the time the forensic investigation is over, and by over I mean where we've been able to determine whether PII was accessed or acquired, there's so much fatigue on the part of the client because they've been through maybe 6 to 10 to 12 weeks of this investigation. And then when you say, well, okay, now that we know roughly what was accessed or acquired, we have to do a data mining exercise to identify each piece of personally identifiable information that was accessed or acquired, do the analysis across 50 states, make notifications to regulators. At that point, there's really a lot of fatigue around the process, but that is the ultimate legal obligation to make that notification under the state laws. And some of those are triggered by access alone, by access and acquisition. So there's still a big chunk of the work that has to be done, long after the forensic investigation occurs. There's also the Office of Foreign Asset Control regulation, that the advisory that came out in October of 2020, where sanctions can be imposed if you pay attackers that are on the list as being banned essentially, or not permitting payment to these parties. And a lot of times that work is done by the forensic experts to vet, is to the extent they can and can compare it against the list, those payments. And if you get that wrong, you're potentially in scope for sanctions being applied against you. So that can be tricky, and facilitating that payment can be tricky. So those are the two big things I wanted to mention. I'm sure Jerry has other stuff too that you want to talk about.
Thanks. So I think the one thing that I think is, I guess it's technically it's exclusive to law firms. So lawyers are not immune from ransomware, right? And the ABA has actually put out guidance on what lawyers essentially have to do, right? And so looking for my notes here, can't find it. Here it is. So there's two opinions. The first one is Formal Opinion 477R, which is securing communication of protected client information. And that basically says, I've just kind of summarized it, essentially a lawyer is required to understand the technology necessary to provide competent representation. And they have to take reasonable effort to prevent inadvertent or unauthorized access. And they list a whole bunch of things in here. And granted, this opinion is pretty old, so technology changes, but they list things like secure Wi-Fi, VPN, unique and complex passwords, firewalls, antivirus, applying security patches, multi-factor authentication, and vendor management. And if you just take that list, which is fairly old because this was a couple years ago, you would have a really good start in being ready to, fight off some of these opportunities, right? The second opinion is a follow-up to that. It's Formal Opinion 483, which is what obligations lawyers have after an electronic data breach or cyber attack. And it says you have an obligation to monitor for the breach. And they actually call out ransomware as something that rises to the level of a breach. So ransomware has been around long enough that it made it into an old ABA opinion. But when the breach is detected, you have to do an incident response. You have to identify how the intrusion happened. You have to assess the scope, figure out a way to restore the integrity of the network, conduct an after-action review, and provide notice. And so lawyers, have a lot of work to do as well because they're representing clients and they have client data. So they have when you talk about regulation and who are the different regulators and states and breach notification, all this other stuff, these are ABA rules, right? So.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like there are at least two dimensions to the legal work of attorneys here. And part of this is addressing the ransomware as an immediate problem, but part of it is also understanding privacy implications. And the ABA opinion that you're mentioning, Jerry was talking about some of the privacy ramifications for clients, but some of the initial considerations that Todd was talking about were focused on that immediate need for response on more on kind of the cybersecurity side. We had a question earlier posted in the chat about the demand for risk analyst and risk management positions. What is your sense about the demand for legal work in these areas? Is this a niche that some people can get in and thrive, or is this an area that is growing?
That one.
Sorry, electronic lights. I think it's an area that's growing, but I would say that on the insurance response side, there is sort of a well-established group of lawyers that has claimed a good portion of the market and handles a good majority of the claims based on their relationship with the carriers. But I guess the way to think about what the future looks like in terms of privacy and cybersecurity work is that the amounts of information that everyone has at their disposal and that is sort of the lifeblood of the economy now and doesn't look like it's going to be slowing down anytime soon. And there's tremendous risk around managing that information. And there are laws that protect consumers and their information, both internationally and domestically. So those aren't going to go away. And the administration just appointed an individual to the FTC in the last day that has a reputation for being a privacy enforcement individual. So it looks like, for the future, there's going to be continued focus in this area and likely a bright future for lawyers that are interested in this space.
I agree that it's growing. I think about this a lot like divorce lawyers, right? So is it to that point where you have, taxes and divorce lawyers and all this other stuff? Probably not. And I don't know that the legal community is ready for that. Like, I don't know if we had the flood of people that were going to, instead of medium to large firms, they were going to small mom and pop firms. I don't know that they could handle it in terms of having the background and the capacity. I don't think we're there yet. So yeah, I think it's growing certainly, and it's getting into some of the medium-sized firms, but it's still a big firm game. I mean, at least with, because that's where there's a lot of money in this, and there's a lot, the companies that get hit are talking about millions and millions of dollars. So it's a pretty big firm game, except for David, of course, because he's crushing it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say too, the two practices that you might want to focus on as an up and coming lawyer, being attracted to firms that are doing a lot of corporate work, M&A work. There's definitely space for lawyers to be advising on risks related to companies acquiring other companies with data. And then on the technology side, companies that are focusing on a corporate practice around technology clients that need advice related to this, maybe not on the M&A side, but just the development side, or they're creating apps, or they're consumer facing. Those are good practices to be engaged with as a privacy lawyer.
The only thing I would add to this, especially for organizations that do not have either cyber insurance or their insurance does not provide very specific counsel to use or forensic vendors to use, is that when it happens to you, you don't know. And you don't know who to call. You will call the cavalry. You'll call whatever relationship you have. So to the extent that lawyers are having, whether small, medium, or large, have relationships with businesses and has the expertise, who knows? You could get that call one night, because when it does happen, it's not convenient, and if you're not ready for it, there's an organization searching, trying to figure out what to do next, and typically they're going to reach out to their counsel and their leadership for help.
Now, we mentioned kind of planning exercises and tabletop exercises. And I've been using that term like I know exactly what it means, but some clarification would be good on that. And in particular, are lawyers involved at that early stage as well?
Yeah, I'll start. I think it really depends. Certainly what your budget is for that. I think there are very specific vendors that help manage tabletop exercises for various industries. If you're certainly starting out, you may not need to do that. It can be a tabletop drill where you identify the incident, you have a phone tree that you begin to call, you have certain expectations as to here's your continuity of business plan you need to execute, and here are the conditions that you need to execute that plan. That's one form that could be centralized in one room, or you could do it where it's distributed and do it in a way that you're using your backup systems, you're using your backup data, you're going through a full-fledged type recovery to a specific incident, up to and including what you package and communicate to external stakeholders, or trips that you have to make sure that your organization is learning. So from my sense, I think it really depends as to whether or not lawyers are involved in the tabletop exercises. It could be expensive, but I could see certainly situations where it's definitely necessary.
So I'm going to say yes, they should be involved, and they should be involved at all stages, right? Because what lawyers do is they don't have to be the people, they're not the IT people. They're not going to do the malware analysis. They're not going to do the forensics. but they are going to they are big picture thinkers, they're risk spotters, they're issue spotters, and so they're going to sit in there and they're going to look for things like, oh, well, this vendor, we want them to do this, and then they can go look at the contract and say like, hey, does it actually account for that in the contract? And if it does, great. If it doesn't, let's get it fixed, right? And so the only way to do, if you don't have the lawyers involved, then you have to tell the lawyers where all the gaps are, and they can turn around and go try to fix them. But if they're in the room and they can listen and learn, you're doing two things. One is you're giving them a chance to issue spot before things happen. And two, you're helping them understand and communicate with your company about the issues themselves. And they're building trust with the IT people, they're building trust with management. And you want that cohesive team. You don't want them to be scared of the lawyers or not want the lawyers in the room. So building that relationship, building the bridge, getting them involved, letting them issue spot. So I would say yes, you want them in the room.
You also have the opportunity, depending on how the tabletop's structured, and how carefully it's structured, is you may be able to get the legal advice subject to the privilege to folks that are more senior in the organization or the board as part of a report out to say, hey, this is what we found, and these are the real risks that you have to address, and not have that be subject to being reviewed externally. So there's that benefit as well.
Any of these guys will push back on that one. Well, again, as I said, I think it really depends upon where you are in the structure and your budget, because that is a different cost profile.
And it sounds like, considering the diversity of approaches taken by different companies and different sizes, different budgets, a deep dive may be something that not every company needs in all cases, but that in-house counsel doesn't perhaps need to be a specialist in cybersecurity and privacy law, but needs to know enough, needs to have some understanding so that to recognize those contexts in which it is important to reach out to experts. So the last kind of a quick question, we're almost out of time, just got a couple of minutes, I wanted to pose to the panel is, if you're a student who is interested in getting into this field, what do you recommend such a student do?
I can tell you what I tell my students. So I listen to podcasts like the Steptoe Cyber Law podcast, read the ABA Cybersecurity Handbook, which gives you a nice broad base of information about cybersecurity. And teach yourself to code. Go get you can online for free, you can take these programming courses, you can buy a book, read it, but learn to program. Use Python, that's a nice and easy one. It doesn't mean you have to be a developer. It doesn't mean you have to be you don't have to know how to code when you're done. But just going through the process of learning how to program puts you in the mindset and gets you exposed to terminology. And I think that's really helpful.
There are a couple of marquee certifications: Certified Information Privacy Professional, CIPP, at the International Association of Privacy Professionals website. Take a look at that certification. And then CISSP, Certified Information System Security Professional, and all the literature associated with that certification. Those are, that's a lot of reading, but that's a great way to get introduced to this field.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and cut it off there. We've got less than a minute left, and I'd like to thank our panel and thank everyone in the audience for joining us. Our webinar series continues on Tuesday, October 26th, with a look at global migration brought about by climate change. We've also got a special Constitution Day webinar coming up on Monday, September 20th, with CNN legal analyst Joan Biskupik, who has covered the Supreme Court for decades and authored biographies of 4 Supreme Court justices. You can learn more about these webinars and register on the UB website. Thank you again, and good night.